Kesha Reynolds wiped down the counter, her hands moving with practiced precision. The old rag had soaked up more sanitizer than dirt, but it didn't bother her. It was just another night at Thompson's liquor store. The same fluorescent lights buzzing above, the same whiskey bottles lined up like soldiers on the shelves, and the same stale air, thick with the scent of alcohol and chipped wood. A faded Western movie played on mute, an old favorite, but she wasn't watching. The silence was her companion, the kind of quiet she had grown used to. It was the kind of silence that was a refuge, a temporary peace, a luxury, really. Back in Iraq, silence meant something different. It wasn't calm or still. It was a warning, a quiet before the storm, before things turned deadly. But here, in this corner of the world, it was a small comfort, something she could take for granted for now. She wiped the counter again. Habit. Not that the counter needed more cleaning, but it gave her something to do, something to keep her hands busy. 6 months she'd been home now. 6 months since she left the desert heat, the sand, the chaos, and returned to this little corner of life, this small, dimly lit liquor store that smelled like memories of a past she wasn't sure how to reconcile with the present. It wasn't much, this place, but it was peaceful in its own way. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced up quickly, her eyes scanning the man who had just entered. Mid-30s, maybe early 40s, but his face was hidden beneath the low brim of a hoodie. His movements were jerky, unsteady, as if he couldn't quite decide whether to be here or somewhere else. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his gaze flicked nervously around the store, like he wasn't sure what he was looking for. Keisha knew that look. She'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers with too much weight on their shoulders, and in the faces of men who had no choice but to keep moving forward, even if they had nothing left to lose. A man down on his luck, or a man about to do something foolish. Her eyes followed him for a moment, but she didn't make a move. No need to. She had seen men like him before, both in war zones and right here at home. Desperate, dangerous. She kept her hands on the counter, not quite letting her guard down, but not giving away any indication that she was paying him special attention. He lingered by the back shelves, pretending to look at bottles, but Keisha could see right through it. She could read the tension in his posture, the slight shift of his weight as he moved. Still, she said nothing, just continued cleaning the counter. "Let me know if you need help finding anything," she offered, her voice calm and even. Her words floated in the air between them, like they always did, but he didn't respond. Not a word, just kept pretending to browse, his eyes darting back toward the door every few seconds. Kesha didn't flinch. She didn't want to make him feel like he was being watched, but she wasn't going to let her guard down either. Out here, the danger wasn't always as obvious as it was back there, in the sand and the blood. People didn't always carry their threats openly, and sometimes it was the quiet ones you had to worry about most. Then the door swung open again, and the sound of it cut through the air like a breath of fresh air after a storm. An older man shuffled in, a regular customer. Mr. Henry, always looking for his six-pack. She didn't have to think about it. It was just routine. He was a kind face, someone who knew her name, who'd ask about her day and tell her the same old stories about his grandkids. "Evening, young lady," he greeted her, his voice as warm as always. Kesha smiled, nodding back. "Evening, Mr. Henry." The man in the hoodie stiffened for a moment, his shoulders jerking as if he didn't like the interruption. His eyes darted toward Mr. Henry, then back at Kesha. She saw the flash of uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't like being watched, didn't like the company. Kesha didn't think much of it. Just another odd little moment in an otherwise routine evening. But that was the thing about moments. They could change without warning, and everything could shift in the blink of an eye. She wiped the counter once more. And then, without any further warning, the sound of metal scraping against metal shattered the stillness. A loud bang rang out, and Keisha's heart skipped a beat. The man in the hoodie had pulled a gun. His shaking hand pointed it directly at her. She could hear the rasp of his breath, see the panic in his eyes. "Give me all the cash. Now." His voice cracked under the weight of his own desperation. Everything else faded away. The TV, Mr. Henry, the shelves full of alcohol. Nothing mattered but the man in front of her. Kesha stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clear. The gun was real, and so was the threat. But something else was in the air too. Something Kesha knew well. Something that had saved her before and would save her now. The man didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know that the calm woman standing behind the counter wasn't just any cashier. He didn't know that the quiet, unassuming woman in front of him had faced things much worse than this. He didn't know that Kesha Reynolds wasn't about to be intimidated by anyone, least of all someone who had no idea what it meant to be truly tested. She took a breath, slow and steady, her fingers hovering just below the counter. Her instincts flared. Her hands didn't shake. Instead, they were ready for anything. The gun felt heavy in Kesha's line of sight. The man in the hoodie's hand trembled as it aimed directly at her, the barrel of the weapon glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. The rattling of his breath filled the space between them, each shaky exhale revealing just how fragile his grip on control was. Kesha didn't flinch. Her mind raced, but her body remained still, her every muscle coiled like a spring waiting to release. "Give me all the cash now." His voice cracked under the weight of his desperation, but there was no mistaking the fury behind his words. It wasn't the kind of voice she'd heard from a man with a plan. It was the voice of a man with no other choice. A man teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, but she wasn't just looking at the man holding the gun. She saw the anger, the fear, and the panic in his face, but she also saw something else. His hesitation. He was scared. He was a desperate man with no experience, trying to project strength that wasn't there. The way his shoulders sagged after every shaky command, the twitch in his hand. The gun wasn't even pointed at her anymore, drifting slightly to the side as he tried to steady himself. Kesha had seen that look before. It was the same one she'd seen in the eyes of soldiers during their first missions, the ones who hadn't yet learned how to live with the constant tension that came with being in a war zone. The ones who still believed that fear could be controlled with enough force, with enough shouting, enough pretending. But Kesha knew better than to play into that. She had learned in the toughest, most unforgiving environments that a person's silence could be just as powerful as their actions. That a moment of calm could unravel everything. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She let the quiet stretch on, pressing down the rising tension in the room. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice low, but steady. Her tone was the same as it had been before, calm and unshaken, as if this were just another customer needing help finding something on the shelf. She didn't raise her hands, didn't take a step back. She stood there, in full view of the man and his gun, but she wasn't afraid. For a split second, he hesitated. His eyes flicked between her face and the gun, his mouth opening as if to say something, but the words got stuck. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his grip on the weapon tightened, but the uncertainty never left. It was a game of chicken now, a dangerous standoff where the slightest shift could change everything. But Kesha wasn't going to blink first. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear in her eyes. "Just put the gun down," she said, her voice firm. Not demanding, but assertive. "You're not going to get what you need like this. There's another way." He looked at her, his eyes wide, as if trying to figure her out. She could see the cogs turning in his mind, the doubt creeping in. She had seen men like him before, men who thought they had no other choice, men who believed they were trapped in their circumstances. And maybe for a moment, he believed that pointing a gun at her would get him out of whatever hole he had dug for himself. But Kesha knew better. She had lived through situations where she couldn't afford to hesitate, where every second counted, where doing the right thing wasn't always obvious. She had made choices in the past, ones that would haunt her forever, but ones that had made her stronger. She had walked through the fires of war, stared down death in its many forms, and had never backed down. This was different, though. This wasn't about a soldier in a war zone. This was a man with nothing left to lose, someone who felt the world had pushed him into a corner, someone who had reached the point of no return. But Cashier understood that kind of desperation. She had felt it herself, more than once. The door jingled again, the sound of it familiar, but it was nothing like the calm entry of Mr. Henry earlier. No, this time, the bell rang with an urgency that made both Cashier and the man in the hoodie stiffen. Another person had walked in, but Cashier didn't dare look. She didn't want to shift her focus for even a second. It was just her and this man, and until he made a decision, nothing else mattered. Cashier's eyes remained locked on his. "You're not alone in this. You don't have to make this choice." His hand wavered slightly, the barrel dipping just a little as he seemed to reconsider. For a moment, she could see it in his eyes, the internal battle raging inside him. He was at a crossroads, and Cashier had to wonder if he even realized it. Did he know that this moment could change everything for him? That this could be the time when his life could go down one path or another? He was about to speak, but before he could say another word, Mr. Henry, the regular customer, cleared his throat. Cashier's heart skipped a beat. "Everything all right in here?" Mr. Henry asked, his voice as calm as ever, his weathered face appearing around the corner of the aisle. He must have sensed the tension in the air. The robber's eyes snapped toward Mr. Henry, and in that instant, Cashier knew he had lost whatever little control he'd managed to hold on to. His gun was now fully aimed at Mr. Henry, the shaking even more pronounced, his breath quickening with panic. But Cashier wasn't about to let it escalate. She could feel it. This was the moment, the split second where everything changed. She took a slow, steady step forward, making her presence known. "You don't want to do this," she said again, her voice a low command. She didn't look at Mr. Henry. Her eyes were fixed on the robber, watching his every move, reading the subtle shifts in his posture. He was cornered, and Cashier knew what happened when someone desperate was cornered. It was a dangerous moment, but also one she had learned to control. There was a pause, a pregnant silence, and then, slowly, the man lowered the gun. His entire body sagged, as if the weight of his own decisions had finally caught up with him. Cashier didn't let up. Her posture remained strong, her hands still under the counter, ready. But her voice had softened. "It's not too late," she said, almost as if speaking to herself as much as to him. "You're not too far gone." For a long moment, no one spoke. The gun trembled in the robber's hand, his body shaking with the weight of what he had almost done. Then, without another word, he turned, stumbling backward, and bolted for the door, the bell jingling as he disappeared into the night. The door slammed shut behind the robber, the jingle of the bell echoing through the stillness of the store. Cashier stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but her breath steady. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it in. The adrenaline that had surged through her veins only a few seconds ago began to ebb away, leaving a strange calm in its wake. The immediate threat had passed, but Cashier couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in that brief exchange. Mr. Henry, still standing near the fridge section with his six-pack in hand, seemed to have sensed the danger had passed as well. He stepped forward, his face creased in concern, but with a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He placed the six-pack on the counter and gave Cashier a once-over. "You all right, young lady?" Cashier didn't answer right away. She was still processing everything. Her mind replayed the scene. The trembling hand holding the gun, the look of desperation in the robber's eyes, the way he'd frozen when she spoke. It all felt like something she should have seen coming, something familiar. It was like she had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even though she had never expected it to happen like this. "Yeah, I'm fine," Cashier finally said, her voice steady, but her words felt heavier than she intended. She gave Mr. Henry a brief nod, trying to brush off the moment, but the weight of it lingered in the pit of her stomach. She knew she was fine. But was she really? Mr. Henry didn't look convinced, but he didn't press her further. Instead, he picked up his six-pack, gave Kesha a thoughtful smile, and muttered, "Well, I'll be going now. Take care of yourself, Kesha." She nodded again, watching him walk out the door with a slow, deliberate pace. As the door closed behind him, the silence settled back into the store, deeper this time, like the world outside had been temporarily suspended. Kesha wiped down the counter again, not because it needed it, but because it gave her something to do. It kept her hands busy while her mind raced. Her eyes glanced over at the cash register. She hadn't even touched it. The whole exchange with the robber had been so quick, so sudden, that she hadn't had time to think about anything else. The register still sat there, untouched, the money inside just waiting to be counted, just waiting for her to finish the task that had been interrupted. But there was no rush. Kesha took a deep breath and leaned back against the counter. She had always prided herself on keeping her head in any situation, whether it was when she was on duty overseas or when she was working here in this liquor store. But tonight had been different. She could feel it deep down. This wasn't just another incident to brush off. This was a reminder of what she had survived, what she had lost, and what she had gained. Her fingers drifted over the scar on her left wrist, a small reminder of her time in Iraq. The memory of the explosion that had almost taken her life, the way the blast had thrown her body into the air like a ragdoll, the burning pain in her side as she had dragged herself to safety. Those memories had been buried deep for years. She hadn't talked about them. Not with anyone. But sometimes, like tonight, they had a way of resurfacing, and she was forced to confront them all over again. It was always the silence that got to her, the long, empty moments where the weight of everything she had lived through pressed down on her shoulders like a storm cloud. But in a way, the silence also gave her strength. She knew how to exist in it, how to survive it. She had done it for years, learning how to hold her ground even when the world around her felt like it was falling apart. But that wasn't something most people understood. Kesha wasn't like everyone else. She had seen things, done things, been through things that most people could never comprehend. She had seen the darkest corners of the world and had fought tooth and nail to make it out alive. The woman who stood behind this counter was not the same woman who had walked into the store 6 months ago. Back then, she had been raw, still bruised from the wars that had followed her home, unsure of what kind of life she was meant to live. But now she had found a semblance of peace, a quiet life, a life where she didn't have to confront her demons every day, where she didn't have to keep looking over her shoulder, wondering if the next moment would be the one that would break her. But tonight had shaken her, not because of the robber. She could handle that. It was the sudden realization that her silence, the quiet way she lived her life, had its own power. She hadn't been pretending to be weak. She had just been waiting for the moment when she would need to stand up, when she would need to show what she was capable of. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time, Kesha didn't flinch. She looked up, expecting another customer. She wasn't surprised when she saw the young man who walked in. He was the same age as the robber, maybe a little younger, and he had the same look in his eyes, the same hunger. But there was something different about him, something that made Kesha pause. He moved toward the counter slowly, cautiously, his eyes flicking over the shelves before settling on Kesha. He was wearing a light jacket and jeans, nothing out of the ordinary, but the way he carried himself, it was familiar. It reminded her of the men she'd seen in Iraq, young men, lost and desperate, looking for something that might never come. He cleared his throat as he reached the counter, and Kesha immediately met his gaze. I don't mean to bother you," he started, his voice shaky, "but could you help me find something?" Kesha's eyes softened. She nodded slowly. "What are you looking for?" His gaze flicked to the bottles behind her, then to the register. He swallowed hard. "Just something strong." His voice trailed off. She didn't ask him why. She didn't need to. She had seen this before. People came to places like this when they were looking for something: comfort, escape, or just a temporary numbing of the pain they carried inside. She didn't judge. She simply reached for a bottle on the shelf, placing it in front of him. "Here," she said, her tone calm. "That'll do the trick." He looked at it for a moment, then back at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. You don't seem like the kind of person who just works here," he said. His words hung in the air for a moment before he continued. "You've been through something, haven't you?" Kesha's lips pressed together into a thin line. She didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. There were things that couldn't be explained in words, things that a person could see in your eyes if they were paying attention. The young man seemed to realize that he had stepped too far, his expression shifting into one of uncertainty. He placed the money on the counter, his eyes flicking back to the door, then to Kesha once more. "I'll take this," he said, his voice quieter now. There was a vulnerability there, a crack in the armor he had tried to put up. Kesha took the money, her fingers brushing his for a brief second. There was no judgment in her touch, no pity, just understanding. "Take care of yourself," she said softly, watching him walk out the door. As the door swung shut behind him, Kesha found herself back in the silence again. But this time, it didn't feel quite as heavy. The silence had changed. It wasn't just the space between her and the world. It was the space between who she had been and who she had become. And for the first time in a long time, Kesha felt the weight of that transformation settling comfortably into her bones. The store was empty now, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden shelves, as if the building itself was sighing in relief. Kesha glanced at the clock on the wall. Another hour had passed since the last customer had left. The night had taken on a strange heaviness, as if the air itself was thick with unanswered questions. She stood behind the counter, hands resting flat on the surface, but her mind was miles away. The robber, the young man, Mr. Henry, each of them had left her with something, a small piece of their lives, a fragment of their struggles. Kesha couldn't help but think about the choices that had brought them all to that point, to this moment. The people she encountered here, the ones who passed through the doors of Thompson's liquor store, were all carrying invisible burdens, each one just trying to make it through the day. They weren't much different from the soldiers she had served with, or from the faces she had seen back home after the war. Everyone was fighting something. But Kesha knew something most people didn't. She knew that sometimes the hardest fights weren't the ones that happened in the streets or in the battlefields. The hardest ones were the quiet ones, the ones people waged in their minds when no one was watching. The silent struggles of trying to survive a world that had a way of breaking you without anyone ever knowing. That was the kind of fight Kesha knew best. The bell above the door jingled again, snapping her out of her thoughts. A familiar face appeared in the doorway. But this time, Kesha didn't feel the immediate tension she had when the robber walked in. Instead, she recognized the young man from earlier, the one who had bought the bottle, the one who had looked at her with that questioning gaze. He was back, but this time, there was something different in the way he stood. Something purposeful. Kesha looked up from the counter, her hands automatically moving to straighten the papers and pens that were scattered across the surface. She had learned over the years that focusing on small tasks helped calm the chaos in her mind. It gave her a sense of control. She nodded as the young man stepped closer. "You forgot something?" she asked, her voice even but laced with curiosity. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between her and the door, as if making sure no one was watching. Then he took a deep breath and spoke in a low voice. "No, I wanted to apologize. For earlier, I shouldn't have said that. About you, being through something." He swallowed, his throat tightening as if the words were difficult to come by. I don't know. You just don't seem like someone who's here by accident." Kesha raised an eyebrow, studying him carefully. She had been in plenty of situations like this. People coming back to apologize after the weight of their words had settled in. But there was something different in the way he spoke. something raw. She didn't know whether it was courage or vulnerability, but she could tell that he wasn't here to make excuses. He was here to make sense of something. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly, leaning against the counter. "We all say things we don't mean sometimes." His eyes flickered, as if considering her words carefully. "Maybe, but this feels different. I don't even know why I said it. But there's something about you. I don't know. You seem like you've seen more than most people, like you've been through hell and came out stronger. And I guess I just wanted to understand." Kesha studied him for a long moment, considering her next words. She wasn't used to people trying to understand her. The woman behind the counter at the liquor store wasn't someone who got many deep questions or long-winded conversations. Most people came in, bought their drinks, and left, never looking twice at the woman who had seen more than they could imagine. But this guy, he was different. She could see it in his eyes. The desperation, the searching. It was like he needed something from her, something she wasn't sure she had the strength to give. "You're not wrong," Kesha said slowly. "I've been through things I don't talk about. But I'm not special for surviving it. I didn't do anything that anyone else couldn't do. The difference is, I didn't give up." The man nodded, his expression softening as he seemed to digest her words. He didn't respond right away, as if he was giving himself time to process the weight of her statement. Kesha could see the conflict in his eyes. He was clearly searching for something, maybe even looking for some kind of permission to forgive himself, or to stop running from whatever had been chasing him for so long. "You ever feel like you're just stuck?" he finally asked, his voice quieter now. Kesha's lips pressed together as she thought about her own journey. The years spent in the military, the years spent living with memories she couldn't shake, the years spent back home trying to fit into a world that didn't quite understand her. She knew what it felt like to be stuck, to be in a place where nothing felt right, where every decision seemed to lead to the same dead end. But she also knew what it meant to keep going, even when you felt like you couldn't take another step, even when the weight of everything was crushing you. "Yeah," Kesha said quietly. "I've been stuck before, but you have to decide that it's not where you're going to stay." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, Kesha saw something other than uncertainty in his gaze. There was a flicker of understanding, like he was starting to see through the layers of his own confusion. He took another breath, this time slower, more deliberate, and Kesha knew that whatever had brought him back here tonight, whatever struggle he was facing, it wasn't just about the bottle or the empty words he'd thrown out earlier. It was about something deeper. "I've been running," he admitted, almost to himself. "From everything. From my past. From the mess I've made. And I think maybe I need to stop. I think maybe I need to face it." Kesha didn't say anything at first. There was nothing to say. He had already said everything she needed to hear. The hardest step for anyone wasn't the one they took physically. It was the step they took in their mind, when they made the decision to face what they had been avoiding. She had been there herself, many times, and while she couldn't give him the answers, she could offer him the same thing she had found in her darkest moments: hope. "Facing it isn't easy," Kesha said, her voice steady. "But it's the only way out. You don't have to do it alone." The young man nodded again, a hint of resolve in his expression. For the first time, Kesha saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Not desperation, not fear, but a kind of clarity. He was on the edge of something. And maybe, just maybe, he had started the journey toward breaking free. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Kesha didn't reply right away. She simply nodded, watching as he turned and walked out the door. The bell jingled once more, signaling his departure, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't heavy. It was a silence filled with possibility. The sun had barely started to rise, casting a soft orange hue across the store as Kesha wiped down the counter for the 100th time. The night had been long, but it was a different kind of long than she had known in the past. She wasn't just enduring the hours, she was processing, reflecting on everything that had unfolded in the last 24 hours. The silence in the store was almost comforting now. Keisha felt a shift within herself, a realization that she had faced something far more intense than a simple robbery or a random encounter. She had been tested, not by the robbery itself, but by the way it had forced her to confront her own demons. The young man's apology, his moment of vulnerability, had been the catalyst for something she didn't expect, an awakening of sorts. The weight she had been carrying for so long seemed a little lighter now, as though, in some strange way, she had passed a test she hadn't even known she was taking. She could still see the man's face in her mind. His look of desperation when he first stepped through the door, the hesitation in his voice as he tried to make sense of the chaos around him. He was just like so many others who had crossed her path in her life. People who were broken, lost, trying to find some meaning in a world that had shown them too much cruelty. The difference between him and the others was that he had the courage to reach out, to take a step toward healing, instead of spiraling deeper into the chaos. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it without hesitation, curiosity sparking in her chest. "Hey, it's the guy from last night. I just wanted to thank you again for talking to me. I'm starting therapy today. I don't know if it'll help, but I feel like I have to try. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to make things right. Thanks for being there." Keisha stared at the message for a long time, a lump forming in her throat. She had expected him to walk out of her life and return to whatever struggles had brought him here in the first place. But this was different. He had taken that one small step forward, and it gave her a sense of hope she hadn't realized she needed. Her mind drifted back to her own journey, to the years spent on a battlefield, and then coming home to a world that felt disconnected from everything she had known. The trauma, the isolation, it was all still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, but something had shifted. After years of silence, she had found a way to speak, to be heard, even in the quietest of moments. And now, it seemed that someone else was finding their voice too. She smiled to herself, a soft, almost imperceptible smile that reflected a quiet pride. Maybe this was what she had been meant for all along, not to fight in the way she had been trained, but to give others the strength to fight their own battles. It wasn't always about saving someone else. Sometimes it was about showing them that they had the power to save themselves. The door chimed again, breaking her thoughts. Keisha looked up, her heart still heavy with the emotions from the previous night. But this time, there was no sense of dread, no foreboding feeling in the pit of her stomach. This time, the person who walked in wasn't a threat. It was Mr. Henry, the regular customer. His familiar presence brought a sense of calm to the space as it always did. "Evening, Keisha," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Evening, Mr. Henry," she replied, offering him a small smile as she greeted him. She was starting to realize that even in the small interactions, there was something meaningful. The way people showed up, the way they trusted her with their stories, even if they didn't always realize it. Mr. Henry walked toward the fridge, the old refrigerator humming behind him as he grabbed his usual six-pack. As he made his way to the counter, he paused, looking at Keisha with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I heard about what happened here last night," he said, his voice softer than usual. Keisha nodded, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Yeah, it was unexpected. You know, sometimes we don't know the battles people are fighting. We assume things based on how they look or what they do, but everyone has their own story," Mr. Henry said, as if he had just discovered some great truth. "I can't say I know much about what you've been through, but I do know this. You're one tough lady." The words hung in the air for a moment. Keisha wasn't sure why, but hearing them now, after everything that had happened, they felt like a validation she didn't realize she needed. In a world that so often overlooked the strength of people like her, people who stayed quiet, who kept their heads down, who just did their jobs, this simple acknowledgement meant more than words could express. "Thank you," Kesha said quietly, her voice betraying the deep emotion she felt. "I try." Mr. Henry gave her a small smile and placed the six-pack on the counter. "You do more than try. You make a difference, even when you don't realize it." Kesha rang up his purchase, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She didn't know if Mr. Henry had any idea how much his words meant to her, but she was starting to believe that maybe he did. Maybe we all had a way of making a difference, in big ways and small, and we just didn't always see it. As Mr. Henry left the store, Kesha felt the weight of the night's events settle into something more manageable. She wasn't just working a dead-end job anymore. She wasn't just existing. She was part of something bigger than herself, something that involved all the people she encountered, even if just for a moment. She had found her purpose, not in the way she expected, but in a quiet, understated kind of way. Maybe that was enough. And for the first time in a long while, Kesha felt at peace with the idea of what was to come next. The morning light pierced through the blinds of the liquor store, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Kesha stood behind the counter, eyes focused on the busy street outside. The world was waking up, and so was she. The events of the last few days had changed something inside of her, something deep and undeniable. She had seen the worst of people, the desperation in the eyes of a man who would point a gun at her. And yet, in that same man, she had found something unexpected: remorse, vulnerability, a chance for redemption. It was all too surreal. As the store hummed with the sounds of customers coming and going, Kesha couldn't help but replay the words he had sent her in that message. "I'm starting therapy today. I don't know if it'll help, but I feel like I have to try." His message wasn't just a thank you. It was a promise to himself that he wasn't going to be defined by his mistakes, that he was going to seek something better for himself, something that he couldn't just find in a bottle or a quick fix. A soft knock on the door broke her from her thoughts. She turned and saw the same man from the night before, his face now free of the panic and desperation that had marked it. He wasn't wearing a hoodie anymore. His shoulders were no longer hunched in fear, but were more relaxed, more hopeful. Kesha's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the way he stood there, tentative, unsure, yet hopeful, that spoke volumes. He was here to face something. Maybe he was here to continue his journey, to show that he was taking that first step toward change. "Hey," he said, voice a little rough but sincere. "I know you didn't expect me to come back, but I just wanted to say thank you again. I've been thinking about what you said last night, about how people don't know the battles we're fighting. You were right. I've been fighting a battle with myself for a long time, and I don't want to keep running from it." Kesha leaned against the counter, her hand steady, but her heart beating faster with every word. It wasn't just his apology that moved her. It was the fact that he was finally, truly owning his past, the mistakes, the pain, and taking responsibility for it. He paused, looking down at his feet for a moment, before lifting his eyes back to hers. "I got a long road ahead, but I want to get better. I want to be better. I don't know if it'll be easy, but I've got to try. For me, for my family, for anyone who might still care about me." Kesha nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling into her chest. She understood that kind of struggle. It was a fight that never really ended, but there was something undeniably powerful about taking the first step, no matter how small, toward change. "You're doing the right thing," Kesha said softly, the sincerity in her voice evident. "It's not going to be easy. There will be setbacks, hard days, and moments where you'll want to give up. But you have something that many people don't have: the courage to keep going, even when it's hard. That's what matters." He smiled faintly, a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. "I didn't expect you to be this understanding. You don't have to be. You don't even know me." "Maybe not," Kesha replied. "But I've seen enough to know that we're all just trying to make it through. We all have our stories, some harder than others, but the important thing is, we're still here. And as long as we're still here, there's always room for change." He nodded, eyes lowering for a moment, lost in thought. The vulnerability between them was palpable, an unspoken bond formed in the quietest of moments. "I'll let you get back to work," he said, turning toward the door. "But I just wanted to thank you for seeing me, for giving me a chance to prove I'm not as bad as I thought I was." Kesha watched as he walked out, his back straighter than it had been the night before. It wasn't a perfect transformation. It wasn't a sudden miracle, but it was a beginning. She stood still for a moment, reflecting on everything that had led to this. There had been the fear, the tension, the unexpected confrontation. And then there had been this moment of grace, when a simple gesture of compassion had allowed him to see a way forward. It wasn't just about the robbery anymore. It was about something bigger: redemption, healing, and the power of human connection. The bell above the door chimed again as the next customer walked in. But this time, Kesha wasn't thinking about the store, the job, or the mundane routine that had once filled her every day. She was thinking about the people who crossed her path, the stories they carried, and how sometimes all it took was a small moment of understanding to change the course of a life. She couldn't save everyone. She couldn't fix all the brokenness in the world. But for that brief moment, she had made a difference. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the day unfolded, Kesha found herself looking forward to whatever came next, not with fear or hesitation, but with hope. The road ahead was still long, but it didn't seem as daunting as it had before. She was no longer just a witness to the world's struggles. She was part of the solution. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the strength to stand tall and face whatever came her way. The past had shaped her, but it wouldn't define her. Her future was still unwritten, and she was ready to write it, one chapter at a time.